The radar screen flickered once, then died completely. In the suffocating darkness of the operations center, Lieutenant Colonel Maverick Storm Kellison stared at the blank display, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Somewhere over the Hindu Kush Mountains, 12 Navy SEALs were bleeding out in a cave system, their extraction window closing faster than a coffin lid. The storm that had knocked out their communications was the same monster now painting the Afghan sky in sheets of lightning that could fry aircraft electronics from 20 miles away. "Ma'am, we've lost contact with Razor Team." The radio operator's voice cracked like thin ice. Last transmission indicated heavy casualties, immediate extraction required. The young airman's hands trembled as he adjusted dials on equipment that had gone silent 47 minutes ago. Outside, the wind howled against the base's reinforced walls with the fury of something alive and hungry. Storm pressed her palms against the metal table until her knuckles went white. The mission brief had been crystal clear: high-value target elimination in a Taliban stronghold, quick in and out before the weather turned. But the mountains had other plans. Now her birds were grounded, every pilot on base shaking their heads at the meteorological nightmare painted across their weather displays. Lightning strikes were registering every 30 seconds in a grid pattern that stretched from Kabul to Kandahar. The base commander's voice cut through the static-filled air like a blade. "Colonel, we need options. Those men don't have long." Colonel Marcus Reed had seen 23 years of combat, but even he couldn't hide the desperation creeping into his tone. The satellite imagery showed the storm system expanding, not dissipating. Every minute they waited was another minute closer to writing 12 death notifications. Storm's fingers traced the worn leather of her flight jacket, feeling the familiar weight of wings pinned above her heart. The same wings that had carried her through 3 deployments, 42 combat missions, and a reputation that preceded her into every briefing room. But reputation meant nothing when Mother Nature decided to remind everyone who really controlled the sky. The meteorologist's latest update painted the picture in brutal clarity. Sustained winds at altitude exceeding 80 knots, visibility near zero, and electrical activity that would turn any aircraft into a flying lightning rod. "There has to be something," she whispered, more to herself than anyone in the room. Behind her, 6 other pilots stood in silence, each running calculations that always ended the same way. No aircraft in the inventory could survive what waited beyond those hangar doors. No aircraft except perhaps one, gathering dust in the far corner of the flight line like a forgotten relic from another war. The C-130 Hercules sat under flickering sodium lights, its 4 turboprop engines cold and still. Built in 1987, tail number 741683 had earned its scars across 3 decades of service. Most pilots called it obsolete, a dinosaur from the era of analog gauges and manual controls. But Storm saw something different as she stared through the rain-streaked windows. She saw the only aircraft on base that didn't rely on computerized fly-by-wire systems. She saw their only chance. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. While every modern aircraft on the flight line was paralyzed by the threat of electrical systems failure, the old Hercules operated on purely mechanical controls. Lightning could knock out its radios, its navigation, even its autopilot, but the aircraft would still fly. The pilot would still have control through steel cables and hydraulic pressure, the same systems that had carried cargo through Vietnam monsoons and Desert Storm sandstorms. "I'll take the old bird," Storm announced, turning to face a room full of skeptical stares. The silence stretched like a held breath until Colonel Reed stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. Every person in that room knew the statistics: aircraft struck by lightning had a survival rate that improved dramatically with altitude and speed. But the approach to a combat landing zone required low and slow, the exact opposite of survival protocol. "Storm, that's suicide." Reed's voice carried the weight of command and the crack of genuine fear. "Even if you make it through the storm, You'll be flying blind into hostile territory with no GPS, no radio contact, and no backup. His words hung in the air like smoke, each syllable a reminder of the mathematics of death that governed their profession. But mathematics hadn't accounted for the variable that stood before him now. Storm's smile was thin as a razor's edge, the kind that had earned her the call sign during her first deployment when she'd flown supply drops through a sandstorm that grounded every other aircraft in the squadron. The base operations officer had watched her land that day with winds gusting to 60 knots and visibility measured in yards, not miles. He'd keyed his radio afterward and said simply, "That pilot just flew through hell like she owned it. Storm suits her." "Sir, those SEALs didn't sign up for a desk job." Her voice carried the steel of absolute conviction. "And neither did I," the words echoed in the operations center, each syllable a declaration of intent that brooked no argument. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains like artillery, and somewhere in the darkness, 12 warriors waited for salvation that might never come. The loadmaster who would accompany her mission stepped forward, his face pale but determined. Technical Sergeant Jake Morrison had flown with Storm on 17 previous missions, each one carving another line of trust between pilot and crew. "Ma'am, if you're going, I'm going," he said simply, his New Jersey accent cutting through the tension like a familiar song. Morrison had pulled wounded soldiers from burning aircraft and pushed supply pallets out of cargo doors while under enemy fire. If Storm was flying into hell, he'd be right there beside her. Colonel Reed studied the weather display one final time, watching the angry red mass of the storm system pulse like a living heart across the satellite feed. Every instinct honed by decades of command screamed against this mission, but every fiber of his humanity demanded he give those trapped SEALs every chance, no matter how slim. "You have 1 hour," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you're not airborne by then, we stand down until the weather breaks." Storm nodded once, sharp as a salute, then turned toward the door. The weight of 12 lives pressed against her shoulders as she stepped into the howling wind, her boots splashing through puddles that reflected the lightning above like broken mirrors. The old Hercules waited in the darkness, patient as death and twice as reliable. Tonight, she would ask it to carry her through the gates of hell itself. And somewhere in the Hindu Kush, 12 Navy SEALs clung to life and hope in equal measure. The maintenance chief met them at the aircraft, his coveralls soaked through and his face grim with professional concern. Chief Master Sergeant Ramon Vasquez had worked on C-130s for 22 years, and he'd never pre-flighted an aircraft for a mission like this. "She's mechanically sound," he shouted over the wind, "but Storm, this bird wasn't built for what you're asking." His words were lost in a crash of thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. "Chief, has she ever let us down?" Storm's question carried layers of meaning that went beyond mechanical reliability. This aircraft had carried wounded warriors home, delivered supplies to isolated outposts, and landed on strips that barely qualified as roads. Every rivet and bolt had been tested in the crucible of combat, and the old bird had never failed to bring her crew home. Vasquez's smile was barely visible in the darkness, but his voice carried unmistakable pride. "No, ma'am, she hasn't." He handed Storm the maintenance forms, his signature already scrawled across the bottom line in waterproof ink. "Bring her back, Colonel, and bring those boys home." The chief stepped back into the rain, watching as Storm and Morrison climbed aboard the aircraft that would either save 12 lives or claim 2 more. The cargo bay of the Hercules was a cathedral of aluminum and steel, empty except for medical supplies and the fold-down seats that would carry wounded SEALs to safety. Storm ran her fingers along the aircraft's skin, feeling the subtle vibrations that spoke of engines turning over and systems coming online. Morrison moved through his pre-flight checks with the precision of a surgeon, each switch, engage a critical component in the machine that would challenge heaven itself. "Storm, this is base operations." The radio crackled to life as they completed their pre-start checklist. "Weather update shows the storm intensifying. Sustained lightning activity across your entire route." The meteorologist's voice carried the clinical detachment of someone delivering a death sentence in scientific terms. Wind shear, electrical activity, turbulence, each parameter exceeded the operational limits of military aviation. "Copy base. We're starting engines," Storm replied, her hands moving across controls worn smooth by decades of pilots who had faced their own impossible missions. The first engine coughed to life with a rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Earth. One by one, the remaining 3 engines joined the symphony, their combined power creating a wall of sound that drowned out even the storm's fury. The tower controller's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion as he cleared them for takeoff. "Hercules 741683, you are cleared for takeoff runway 27. Wind 340 at 45 gusts to 70. Altimeter 289 or 5. Each number was a piece of the puzzle that would determine whether they lived or died in the next hour. The crosswind alone exceeded normal operational limits, but normal had ceased to exist the moment 12 SEALs had called for help. Storm advanced the throttles with the smooth precision of a concert pianist, feeling 37 years of aviation experience flow through her fingertips into the controls of an aircraft that had become an extension of her will. The Hercules lurched forward against the wind, its massive props biting into air thick with rain and electricity. Through the cockpit windows, the runway lights blurred into streaks of amber and white, marking the path between earth and sky like fallen stars. "V1, Morrison called out, his voice steady despite the aircraft's violent shaking as it fought against wind shear that could flip them inverted in an instant. The old Hercules climbed into the storm with the determination of a warrior entering battle, each foot of altitude a victory against physics and fate. Below them, the lights of the base disappeared into darkness, leaving only the instruments and the lightning to guide their way through a sky that had declared war on anything foolish enough to challenge its dominion. The first lightning strike came at 8,000 feet, a brilliant flash that turned the cockpit white as noon and left temporary blindness in its wake. The electrical systems flickered but held, analog gauges continuing their steady dance of information, while digital displays elsewhere would have failed completely. Storm felt the aircraft shudder as electricity coursed through its aluminum skin, seeking ground through the static wicks mounted at every wingtip and trailing edge. "Holy mother of!" Morrison's curse was cut short by another strike, this one close enough to paint shadows on the instrument panel and fill the air with the sharp smell of ozone. The radio went dead with a pop of static, leaving them isolated in a bubble of aluminum and prayers, cut off from the world below, and the help that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. But Storm pressed on, her hands steady on the yoke as she navigated by compass and dead reckoning through air that tried to tear the wings from their aircraft with every gust. The old Hercules had been built for missions like this, designed by engineers who understood that sometimes the only choice was to fly through hell and hope to find heaven on the other side. Tonight, heaven wore the camouflage uniforms of 12 Navy SEALs, and hell was everything that stood between them and home. The storm's fury reached its crescendo as they crossed into Taliban territory, lightning strikes coming so frequently that the cockpit strobed like a nightclub from the 1980s. Each flash revealed glimpses of mountains below, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised death to any aircraft foolish enough to descend. Storm's flight path took her through valleys mapped by memory and marked by the bones of other aircraft that had challenged these peaks and lost. "GPS is out," Morrison reported, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "Compass heading still good, but we're flying on prayers and dead reckoning." The loss of satellite navigation meant they would find their landing zone the way pilots had for decades before computers, by skill, experience, and the kind of luck that came to those who deserved it most. Storm nodded, her eyes scanning instruments that danced with electrical interference but continued to provide the basic information needed to keep them airborne. Altitude, airspeed, engine parameters, the fundamental constants that separated controlled flight from catastrophic failure. "How long to target?" she asked, though both of them knew the answer would be an educated guess at best. 15 minutes, maybe 20, Morrison replied, consulting a paper chart that had become their primary navigation aid. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. In an age of satellite navigation and computerized flight management systems, they were navigating like barnstormers from the Great Depression, following roads and rivers, and hopping their calculations were close enough to matter. The radio suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static that resolved into human voices. Any station, this is Razor Team. We are running low on medical supplies and ammunition. Request immediate extraction. The transmission was weak and broken, filtered through ionospheric interference and the electrical chaos of the storm, but it carried the unmistakable weight of desperation that marked men who had accepted their fate but refused to surrender. Storm keyed her radio, hopping against hope that her transmission would break through the atmospheric interference. Razor Team, this is Hurricane 741683. We are en route to your position. Prepare for extraction in approximately 15 minutes. The silence that followed stretched like an eternity until the radio crackled again with a voice that carried 20 years of special operations experience. Hurricane, this is Razor 6. Confirm you are inbound to our position in current weather conditions. The voice belonged to Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus "Tank" Davidson, a legend in the SEAL community who had led more combat missions than most officers see in a full career. His question carried the weight of disbelief mixed with desperate hope. No aircraft in the Navy inventory was rated for the conditions currently painting the sky in sheets of electricity and rain. Razor 6, that's affirmative. We are a C-130 Hercules inbound to your position. Weather is not a factor. Storm's reply carried the confidence of someone who had made peace with the impossible and decided to do it anyway. The old Hercules shuddered through another lightning strike, its aluminum skin conducting electricity like a Faraday cage while protecting the humans inside from the very forces trying to destroy them. The response from the ground came immediately, Tank's voice carrying a mixture of relief and amazement that transcended military protocol. Hurricane, you're either the craziest pilot in the Air Force or the best. Either way, we'll take it. The transmission dissolved into static as another lightning strike lit up the sky, but Storm had heard enough. Somewhere below, 12 warriors were counting on her to do the impossible, and she had never been one to disappoint. The descent began at 12,000 feet, Storm gradually reducing power while fighting wind shear that threatened to flip the aircraft inverted with every gust. The mountains below were invisible in the darkness and clouds, marked only by the occasional lightning strike that revealed jagged peaks rising like the teeth of some primordial beast. Navigation was reduced to compass headings and elapsed time, the fundamental skills that separated pilots from passengers in an age of automated flight. There, Morrison pointed through the rain-streaked windscreen at a series of infrared strobes barely visible through the storm. Razor teams marking their position. The lights were faint as dying stars, but they represented the difference between life and death for 12 men who had volunteered for a mission that had gone sideways in the worst possible way. The landing zone was nothing more than a stretch of relatively flat ground between two ridgelines, carved from the mountainside by centuries of erosion and marked now by the desperate hopes of America's finest. Storm began her approach, the ancient Hercules responding to her inputs with the reliability of an old friend. The aircraft had been built in an era when pilots flew by feel and intuition, when successful missions depended more on skill than technology. Tonight, those old-school virtues would determine whether 12 SEALs went home to their families or became another casualty statistic in a war that had already claimed too many good men. The landing lights cut through the darkness like sword blades, illuminating a strip of ground that looked more like a dried riverbed than an actual runway. Rocks and debris scattered across the surface promised to test every system on the aircraft, while crosswinds gusting to 50 knots threatened to push them into the mountainsides that rose on either side of their approach path. It was the kind of landing that separated professionals from amateurs, and Storm had been proving her professional credentials for over a decade. "Gear down, flaps full," she called to Morrison, who responded with the mechanical precision of a crew that had trained for exactly this moment. The Hercules configured for landing like a seasoned warrior donning armor, each system engaging with the smooth coordination that marked countless hours of practice and preparation. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside the cockpit, everything was focused calm and professional competence. The touchdown was harder than textbook perfect, but softer than disaster, the main landing gear absorbing the impact with a chorus of groans and squeaks that spoke of metal stressed to its limits, but holding firm. Storm applied reverse thrust, while fighting to keep the aircraft centered on a surface that seemed determined to tear the landing gear from its mounts. Rocks pinged against the aluminum skin like hail, each impact a reminder of how thin the line was between success and catastrophe. "Razor team, this is Hurricane. We are on deck and ready for immediate boarding," Storm transmitted as the aircraft rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust and debris. Through the cargo door, she could see figures moving in the darkness, 12 shadows that represented the entire reason for this impossible mission. Each SEAL carried the weight of wounds and exhaustion, but they moved with the purposeful efficiency of professionals who understood that the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. The loading process took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Each wounded SEAL helped aboard by teammates who ignored their own injuries in favor of getting everyone to safety. Tank was the last aboard, his eyes meeting Storm's through the cargo bay with a look that conveyed more than words ever could. These men had faced death together, and now they were trusting their lives to a pilot they had never met and an aircraft that belonged in a museum. "All souls aboard," Morrison reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a mission accomplished despite impossible odds. The cargo bay was filled with the quiet sounds of wounded men receiving medical attention, each SEAL alive, and accounted for despite the ambush that had nearly claimed their lives. The aircraft was now responsible for 14 lives instead of 2, but the mathematics of survival hadn't changed. They still had to fly through hell to reach heaven. The takeoff was even more challenging than the landing, the overloaded Hercules struggling to achieve flying speed on a surface that seemed designed to destroy aircraft tires. Storm held the aircraft on the ground until the last possible moment, then pulled back on the yoke with the smooth authority of someone who had made similar decisions 100 times before. The old bird clawed its way into the storm-lashed sky, climbing through air that tried to tear it apart with every gust of wind. "Hurricane, this is Razor 6, Tank's voice came through the intercom system, filtered through pain medication and exhaustion but still carrying the authority of command. "I don't know how you pulled this off, but you just saved 12 lives tonight. That's something that won't be forgotten." His words carried the weight of the special operations community, where reputation was earned in moments like this and remembered forever. Storm keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the aircraft's violent shaking as it climbed through the worst of the storm. "Razor 6, it's what we do. Just get your people patched up and we'll have you home before you know it." The confidence in her voice masked the reality that their challenges were far from over. They still had to navigate 200 miles of hostile territory while flying through conditions that would ground commercial aviation for weeks. The flight home became a testament to the reliability of analog systems and the skill of pilots trained before computers took over the cockpit. Lightning strikes continued to illuminate the sky like a photographer's strobe light, each flash revealing glimpses of the landscape below while temporarily blinding anyone foolish enough to look directly at it. But the old Hercules pressed on, its mechanical flight controls responding to Storm's inputs with the precision of a fine watch. At 30,000 feet, they finally broke through the top of the storm, emerging into clear air filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. The sudden stillness was almost shocking after hours of violent turbulence, the aircraft settling into smooth flight like a ship finding calm waters after riding out a hurricane. Below them, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but they had climbed above its reach into air thin as hope and twice as precious. Base operations. This is Hurricane 741683. Storm transmitted as they approached friendly airspace. We have 12 souls aboard, multiple wounded, requesting priority handling and immediate medical attention upon landing. The radio crackled with the response that every pilot wanted to hear: clearance for an immediate approach with emergency vehicles standing by. The landing at Bagram was textbook perfect, the Hercules touching down on a runway that seemed wide as a highway after the improvised strip they had used for the pickup. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft as it rolled to a stop, their red and blue lights painting the tarmac in colors that meant salvation for men who had looked death in the eye and lived to tell about it. As the cargo door opened and medical personnel rushed aboard to tend to the wounded SEALs, Storm remained in her seat, her hands still gripping the yoke of an aircraft that had just performed a miracle. The old Hercules sat silent now, its engines cooling in the pre-dawn air, but its work was done. 12 Navy SEALs were alive because a pilot had decided that impossible was just another word for difficult, and an ancient aircraft had proven that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways. Tank approached the cockpit as his teammates were loaded onto stretchers, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes bright with gratitude. "Colonel, I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen flying like that. You just redefined what courage looks like." His words carried the weight of experience earned in places where courage was measured in lives saved and missions accomplished against impossible odds. Storm finally released her grip on the controls, her hands trembling slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. "Chief, you and your men did the hard part. I just provided the taxi service." But even as she spoke, she knew that this mission would be remembered long after the storm clouds had cleared and the wounded had healed. Some moments transcend the ordinary and become legend, and tonight had been one of those moments. The maintenance crew swarmed over the aircraft, checking for lightning damage and assessing the wear from a mission that had pushed every system to its absolute limits. Chief Vasquez approached Storm as she completed her post-flight inspection, his face creased with concern and admiration in equal measure. "Colonel, this bird took a beating tonight, but she held together, just like her pilot." As dawn broke over the Hindu Kush Mountains, the storm finally began to dissipate, its fury spent against peaks that had weathered countless such assaults over the millennia. The weather that had grounded every other aircraft on the base was retreating eastward, leaving behind clear skies and the kind of morning that made pilots remember why they had learned to fly in the first place. Storm stood beside her aircraft in the growing daylight, running her hand along aluminum skin that bore the scars of lightning strikes and the stains of a mission that would be talked about in ready rooms and briefing halls for years to come. The old Hercules had proven that experience and determination could overcome technology and odds, that sometimes the most reliable machine was the one that depended on human skill rather than computer assistance. Colonel Reed approached as the last of the wounded SEALs was loaded into an ambulance, his face showing the relief of a commander who had gambled with lives and won. "Storm, what you did tonight. There's going to be paperwork, investigations, maybe even congressional hearings. Flying into conditions like that violated about 15 different regulations." His voice carried the tone of someone who was about to deliver bad news. But Storm's smile was the same one that had earned her Coulson years ago, the expression of someone who had looked impossible in the eye and decided to dance with it. "Sir, those regulations were written by people who never had to choose between following rules and saving lives. I'll take the hearing over writing death notifications any day." Her words echoed across the flight line with the confidence of someone who had just proven that sometimes the only way to succeed is to redefine what success looks like. The story of that night spread through the military community with the speed of legend becoming reality. Pilots who had spent their careers flying by computer suddenly found themselves studying the manual flight procedures they had dismissed as obsolete. The old Hercules became a symbol of the value of traditional skills in an age of increasing automation, proof that sometimes the best technology is the kind that puts human judgment at the center of the equation. Years later, when aviation historians wrote about the evolution of military air transport, they would mark that storm-lashed night as a turning point, not because it represented technological advancement, but because it demonstrated the timeless value of pilot skill, crew coordination, and the kind of courage that transforms impossible missions into routine entries in aircraft logbooks. The SEALs went home to their families, their wounds healed, and their faith in American aviation restored by a pilot who had proven that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways to bring warriors home.